Rebekah Taussig is a Kansas City writer and educator with her doctorate in creative nonfiction and disability studies. She's spent most of her life immersed in the world of writing and reading because she believes the words we use and the stories we tell matter. You can find her writing about the nuanced experience of disability on her Instagram, Sitting Pretty, or in her memoir by the same name. Please join me in welcoming Rebekah Taussig.
Been looking forward to having this conversation with this group of people for so long, and now we're here, and I'm looking at your beautiful faces, and this is wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and for this conversation, prioritizing this conversation. I'm really excited to dive into it with you. I've also heard that this group, we might kind of have a span of teaching level, teaching that kind of spans the whole education experience. So I kind of wanted to take a poll, like how many of you teach at the college level? All right. And that, like, we have people from the K through 12 group here too. Some of you, all right. And of those people, like, how many of you teach high school? Oh, look at this representation. Awesome. And elementary school. Oh, this is incredible. Okay, and then I know there's also folks here who are not like teaching in front of the classroom, but involved in education in some other ways. So where are those people at? We are all over the map. This is amazing. Ah, gosh. Okay, cool. So the focus of the talk today is disability and inclusion and teaching, right? And so clearly we're all coming at teaching from so many different vantage points, right? We have the K through 12, but also even if you're teaching at the same level, you're teaching different things, you're teaching different groups and sizes of classes. So we're all coming at teaching from so many different vantage points. And disability itself is such a sprawling experience, right? There's so much underneath that umbrella of disability. There's so many different shapes and forms of that experience. And so my job today is to try to bring you into a conversation that holds on to all of that, right? To meet you where you're at, and hopefully provide some big picture perspective shifts, but also maybe some tiny nuggets that you can take with you into your teaching, into your practice. So as Jen mentioned, I'm going to try to not talk all afternoon. I'm going to try to keep it under an hour, and then we're going to have a good chunk of time for Q&A, which is actually my favorite part anyways. Like, I am so eager to hear what you're thinking about, processing, chewing on. So as I talk and share stories and ideas today, if there's anything that pings in your brain, like I would like to hear her speak more to this thing, or I'm not quite sure what to do with this, whatever it is, take a mental note, jot it down. Like, I think we'll have a good amount of time and 100% interested in whatever you're interested in talking about. So regardless of what age or level of teaching you're teaching at, somewhere between 15 and 20% of our students have some kind of disability. And some of those disabilities are diagnosed and disclosed to us, some of them aren't. And there's so many experiences that fall underneath this umbrella of disability, right? The needs of our students can vary tremendously, and the number of students that we have who require accommodations is increasing over time. And schools, of course, are mandated to accommodate those students, right, to create access and resources for those students, and yet so many of them are still falling through the cracks. And we can track that in a number of different ways. We can look at graduation rates and retention rates for disabled and non-disabled students and see that great disparity. And I imagine that the task of trying to catch all of those students can feel daunting, right? I mean, especially now, I know the last few years have been really stretching and draining and long and intense, and teachers are overwhelmed, and as so many professions are, but a lot of people in the teaching world are stretched really thin. And my goal today is not to pile more onto your plate and add like more items on a never-ending checklist of items of things that you need to make sure that you get right. What I want, my hope is that you would leave today feeling energized, fueled up, curious, motivated, refreshed and having a new perspective to bring into your practice as teachers in this profession. And so I have a couple of guiding questions for us today to think about. What if disability in our classrooms was about more than a checklist of accommodation requirements? What if disability could actually be a source of innovation in your teaching? What if thinking about disability was really the prompt that we need to create more inclusive communities for all of our students and our teachers? Big questions. But before we dive into all of that, I thought it might be useful for you to hear a couple of details about my background and my experience in the classroom. So I spent like the vast majority of my life in the classroom as a student, like from kindergarten through my PhD. I was 25 years as a student. And then I was a teacher for about 8 years. So I taught high school for a few years, freshmen and seniors, and then during my PhD, I was teaching some intro-level college classes and some upper-level college classes. So a lot of time in the classroom. And I pivoted in the last few years. I had a book and a baby the same year, and that kind of prompted some shifting in my life. So I've been doing more speaking and writing and workshops and smaller things, smaller workshops. But teaching in the classroom is like a part of who I am, and that's part of why I'm so excited to be with you having this conversation today. But those are some basics about teaching and my what's the word for not CV, resume. That's my teaching resume. But in order to really dig deeper into a conversation about disability and inclusion, I want to draw you a little bit closer into my story. So I've been paralyzed since about the age of 3 from childhood cancer. I don't remember walking. And before I got a wheelchair, there was a few years, this period of time where I just kind of got around moving my body intuitively. I would like pull myself up on a tabletop or like dive down the stairs head first. And I had like this little tricycle that I would pedal around the neighborhood, mostly with my hands. But I got where I needed to go, and I didn't think too much about how I got from place to place. And when I started school, I was exerting so much energy into trying to just like keep up the pace with the people around with my peers. And so I got my first wheelchair so that I could conserve some of that energy for learning. And so my first wheelchair, which you can see on the far right photo, was, you can kind of see the hot pink. It was the 90s. My first wheelchair was hot pink. I covered it with very tacky smiley face stickers that kind of started to peel and fade with time. It was a very cute look. Yes. So I grew up like physically and visibly disabled, and at first I really did not make much of that. I'm the youngest of 6 kids, so I kind of just one of the pack. I grew up playing really hard. I would make up these elaborate dance routines in my wheelchair, and I had dreams that I would lead a dance troupe, and I felt beautiful. Like I was the kid who would wear the full-on dress-up gown to the library. I think at the heart of it, I just really felt like I saw myself as a valuable member of the group. And that bubble of feeling equal and a part of things, eventually it started to disintegrate for me. And I use that word disintegrate and not burst, because it was a really slow and steady process of learning where I fit or didn't fit, or where disability fit or didn't fit into the world around me. A lot of people with disabilities experience bullying or even abuse, and that was not the case for me. I want to be clear about that. But the things that I learned about disability, or the way that I learned to see myself in the world, were taught to me in like 1,000 tiny and enormous ways, right? Like I think the way that we learn about who we are in the world, for all of us, it can be such a subtle thing that we don't realize we're learning anything at all. And that was definitely the case for me. So no one said the words to me like, you don't belong here, or we don't want you around. But I lived in a world that for the most part was not built to include me. I spent a lot of time on the edges of inaccessible playgrounds and gym classes and birthday parties. And I felt all of the friction and inconvenience that came with simply trying to be out in the world in public, for me or for anyone with me, right? Like, how are we going to get her into this building? And how can we include her on this field trip? And being with me seemed to require like all this extra planning and roundabout paths and like going off to away from the group to find the elevator or a different line for the path through the lunch line. I always felt elaborate and like too much. I saw that kids like me were put on a separate school bus, like away from the rest of the kids in our classes. And I remember being so confused by the feeling I had when kids would like fight over who was going to push me to recess. It felt like this should feel good, right? Like people want to be around me, and yet in retrospect, I think that feeling was feeling a little bit more like a class pet than a peer. I did hear messages like, you can be anything you want to be, but even as a kid, I felt kind of skeptical of that. I was like, really? What would that look like? It doesn't seem to be too easy now. What's going to make that easier when I'm an adult? And all I had to do was really look around. Like, I had never seen in real life or in screens on, in films or shows, a visibly disabled teacher or doctor or barista or newscaster, right? Like I didn't have that vision, that model. So after a decade or so on this planet, I slowly and eventually pieced together how I saw the world, how I thought that it worked. And to me, I felt like, well, disability actually means that you're on the outside, separate and far away. I started to see myself as fundamentally different, almost like I was like this alien bobbing through outer space, and I was as someone to maybe gawk at or maybe even marvel over. But either way, I was separate, and I felt like I didn't belong. I do want to pause here to note, I felt like I was the only one on the outside. That was not true. As I've gotten older, I've realized that a lot of people are on the outside for a lot of different reasons. First, there are actually so many people with disabilities in the world, and this is something I did not understand when I was younger. At visible disabilities and invisible disabilities, right? Disability is sometimes wheelchairs, but it's also learning disabilities and epilepsy. It's vision, it's low vision, and folks who are blind. It's folks who are deaf and hard of hearing. It's anywhere on the autism spectrum. It's chronic pain. It's chronic illness. Like you go into the afternoon, right? It's like so many different things. And I didn't know that when I was younger. But also, people can find themselves on the edges or pushed to outsider status for a lot of different reasons: gender and sexuality and being racially stigmatized, and size and class. I mean, there's so many different ways that we can experience that. But a lot of times, and I think especially when we're younger, we feel and believe that we're the only ones on the outside, and that was definitely how I internalized that. So how does a person survive that setup? Like, what do you do when you believe through your bones that you fundamentally don't fit or belong? I knew I had pieced together that disability was the thing that made me push me to the outside, and so I learned to hide it, which might sound silly. Like, wheelchairs are very visible. You can't just like drape a cloak over them and move along. You can see them, but I learned to do this in 1,000 different like instinctual, subtle ways. So I learned to make my needs very small, like go with the flow, pretend like inaccessibility didn't cost me, like whatever you do, don't ever make a fuss. That was through my bones. I learned to hide the different ways that my body looked and moved. So I would dress in ways that sort of hid things. I mentioned earlier that I used to move my body intuitively and crawl and pull myself up. And I stopped doing that. I started to stay in my chair more and more because I didn't want people to see the unexpected ways that I moved my body. the goal with all of this was to make disability such a small part of myself that people would forget about it. And maybe I could just sneak under the radar and fit and be included. Like maybe I could create the image of fitting into the world even if I didn't actually fit into the world. And that's what I did for a good while. And to be honest with you, it worked okay for a time. Like when I was in elementary school, I did pretty well. I did pretty well as a younger child, and I don't think that my teachers or my parents were very alarmed or worried about me having unhealthy coping mechanisms or feeling isolated, or I don't think they would have thought I felt any shame. And I think the first red flag went up when I was in high school. So freshman in high school, I was struggling so hard to keep up. Like I was missing all of these classes. I was perpetually behind. I was always scrambling to keep up with my assignments. And I think it was October of that freshman year that the counselor called me into her basement office. And I have such a vivid memory of this moment, or I can like totally conjure what it felt like to be in that room with her. And I think she asked me a very neutral question, like, so maybe can you tell me a little bit about what's going on? And I didn't get 2 words out before I burst into like the sloppiest, messiest, loudest tears. I mean, like, I still can remember like my tears plopping down onto my skirt and like making a puddle in my lap, because I felt so ashamed of my massive failure to simply keep up with everyone else. I could not understand why it was so hard for me, why I was falling short, but it felt horrible. And I don't remember how the plan was devised. I'm sure my parents were involved, but the plan that the school came up with was that I would take a reduced course load. I took 5 classes instead of 7, and then I took 1 of the correspondence, and that would mean that I got to school an hour late and left an hour early. I remember I felt so relieved by this light schedule, so relieved by this accommodation, and so ashamed that I needed it at all. So we went ahead with this lightened schedule, and I remained like a pretty disengaged high schooler to bare minimum. Like I did not participate in anything extra. And then I graduated, which was good, right? This was an accomplishment, but I finished high school with a very harmful set of beliefs about myself. By the time I graduated, I believed things like I was really helpless. I didn't feel like I belonged. I couldn't picture where I belonged. I was absolutely incapacitated with fear of adulthood, of that leap from childhood into living on my own or having a job or paying my own bills. Like I couldn't imagine it, and I was frozen with fear about that. And those beliefs that I had about myself really shaped a lot of decisions that I made during that leap, right? That important transition. So I went to a community college for a few years and actually really loved it. And then transferred to a 4-year school and felt pretty quickly, it just felt like a waste of time and money because I couldn't figure out what I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to use it. So I dropped out of school. I married my high school boyfriend, not because we were terribly compatible, but because it felt very safe. And the great spoiler that's not a spoiler to anyone is that it didn't go well. And we were divorced shortly after. I mean, the point here is that shame and that fear kept my life very small. I would like to also say it's really unpleasant and uncomfortable to tell this part of the story, right? Like this is not the story I want to tell you, but I'm sharing this part of the story because I want us to be able to look at it together and think about why, how, what happened, how did that happen, what went wrong. Over time, I hope that it's very clear to you that the person talking with you today has learned a lot of things since then, right? And I'm not in that place anymore. And there's been a lot of learning and growth. And over time, one word that has brought a lot of clarity to me in understanding my experience is the word ableism. It's a little word, it's a very loaded word. I imagine that you're probably at least somewhat familiar with it, but just to make sure that we're on the same page about what I mean, when I use that word. I want to talk about a definition. The Oxford English Dictionary defines ableism as discrimination against disabled people, which is a word that or a definition I've always felt like frustrated with how vague that sounds. And so I've come up with my own that is much wordier, of course, than the Oxford English Dictionary. But this is the definition that makes the most sense to me. I think ableism is the process of favoring and building the world around a mostly imagined, quote unquote, average body and mind, while discriminating against those bodies that are perceived to move, see, hear, process, operate, look, or need differently from that vision. And of course, the greater the deviation, the greater the discrimination. That phrase, building the world around a mostly imagined average body and mind, deserves some unpacking, right? There's a lot loaded into that phrase, starting with the word average. Average is a word that we kind of take for granted when we describe people. You know what that means. When I ask you to think of an average student, I imagine something comes into your head, like you can picture that student. But the idea of describing a human as average didn't actually exist until the mid-19th century. Originally, finding averages was a tool that was used by astronomers to more accurately track planets. No attachment to human assessment whatsoever. The word normal wasn't actually used to describe human characteristics until around 1840. Before then, that was a word used by carpenters to describe something as perpendicular. We've changed that. That has come to mean something very different to us today. And really that shift started with a man named Adolf Quetelet in the early to mid 19th century. Quetelet became obsessed with gathering data on human characteristics. He wanted all of the numbers for all the humans. He was measuring, like the average width of a man's chest and the circumference of his thigh and head, but also things like marriages and divorces, and he just wanted all the numbers that he could gather. And this approach to human data really caught on like wildfire at that time. And it fundamentally changed the way that we think about people, the way we organize people, and the way we build the world for people. It's not that there's no purpose to gathering data on human populations, right? Like it can be really useful to look at kind of compare the averages of two distinct groups that can help us track larger patterns or kind of note disparities or inequalities. Like that's how we look at graduation and retention rates for students with and without disabilities, right? That can be useful. The problem is that we have used the notion of normal and average in ways that actually don't make sense. What averages can't tell us is anything terribly insightful about individual human people. And yet we use statistical averages and our notion of normal as our North Star. Like we've let the notion of average and normal captivate our imaginations. We've been taught for over a century now that if we build or design for the average person, that we will be building something that works for most people. And that's actually kind of a myth, that's kind of a fiction, and that can feel jarring to us in the 21st century. So I'm going to tell us a story. I have a story to kind of bring you in on how this works. Like, what are the limitations of designing for average? Now, this might sound counterintuitive at first because I'm going to tell you a story about an airplane, and that doesn't necessarily sound like classroom stuff. But stick with me. So here's the story. It's the 1940s, and the U.S. Air Force realizes that they have this huge and mysterious problem on their hands. Their pilots keep crashing their planes, and they cannot figure out why. And at first they assume this must be human error, like the pilots must be learning something wrong or something that they're doing wrong, and so they follow that trail of thought and come up with nothing. So then they think mechanical flaw, like there must be something wrong with the design of these planes, and so they start scrupulously looking for some kind of mechanical flaw, and again, come up with anything. And so kind of as a last-ditch effort, they recruited one of their lieutenants, Lieutenant Gilbert Daniels, who also had scientific training, to gather all of this data on their pilots. So they had 4,063 pilots, and they gathered measurements for every part of the body for all of these pilots. And then they sort of figure out like these 10 characteristics, these 10 set of measurements are going to be the most useful for anyone who has to fly an aircraft. And so they crunch the numbers and they find the averages for all 10 of these dimensions. And these numbers become sort of the average pilot. This is the prototypical pilot flying their planes. And just to make sure that those numbers represented as most real-life pilots as possible, they opened up the dimensions by 30%. So in other words, like anyone within about 30% of that average in those 10 dimensions would still qualify as an average pilot according to these populations. So everyone pretty much expected that most of those pilots, if not all of those pilots, would adhere to those average dimensions in all 10 categories. I'm curious what you think. How many of the 4,063 pilots do you think fit those 10 dimensions?
30%.
That's a good guess. Any numbers? Guess from thrown out?
600.
600? That would be a good guess. Not one. Out of 4,063 pilots, not a single pilot matched the averages for all 10 of those characteristics. And so they opened it up and they said, okay, what about just 3? Any 3? How many of our 4,063 pilots will match just 3 of those characteristics? And less than 3.5% of those pilots actually fit those dimensions. In other words, designing for the average pilot meant that they were designing for very few of their pilots. And so the Air Force took very swift action. They went back to their manufacturers and they demanded that their airplanes be redesigned in all 10 of those dimensions for pilots anywhere between 5 and 95% of that average. And at first, the airplane manufacturers were like, that's impossible. That's not how this works. And even if we could technically figure out how to solve that problem, like it'd be astronomically expensive, it'd be way too expensive. And the Air Force basically said they didn't budge. They said like, this is a massive problem that needed to be fixed yesterday. And they continued to press for this change, not necessarily because of priority on inclusion or fairness, but because they had a massive problem. Their planes were crashing, it had to get fixed, get it done. And wouldn't you know, they did. They figured it out rather quickly and cheaply. They created adjustable foot pedals and helmet straps and flight suits. They created adjustable seats, which is a technology I assume you're familiar with because it's standard in every single vehicle that we drive now. When we design for the average prototype, we build designs that work for only a few of us and then only temporarily. When we include people on the edges, when we design for those bodies and minds, we find sturdier designs that work for the whole group, more flexible models that work for all of us. The airplane story is like the tip of the iceberg. We see this happening over and over again. In fact, some of the most tools that we rely on the most were originally designed with disability in mind. Closed captioning was originally designed for folks who were deaf and hard of hearing, and now any person who has a phone or is watching a game in a bar across the bar is accessing content through closed captioning, right? Anything from audiobooks to the grippy handle on an Apple peeler to voice to text or speech to text and voice recognition apps to bendy straws were all designed specifically for people on the edges, right? For folks with disabilities. And these tools are essentially the applied products of what we call universal design. That approach to design that looks not to the most average normal prototype. The one that looks, it's the approach to design that looks to the ones on the edges. Designers and builders who practice universal design don't see the person, the exceptional person, as someone to work around, but as a host for clues about how to create tools and spaces and classrooms that work for all of us, that are more sustainable for all of us. We know how to do this, and yet in so many big and important ways, we continue to build the world as if the average pilot, the average student, the average teacher, the average learner was a real thing. We've continued to let this idea of normal captivate our imaginations. So the average body or mind becomes the prototype, the teacher or the student that we imagine as we build and plan and design and create. And this can include physical spaces. That's what we think of often as building, right? A classroom or a school. But it's also how we design our curriculum. It's also the practices and policies built into our communities. It's also the way that we create hierarchies. It shapes our conversations. It's the training that we receive as teachers, the language that we're taught to use. All of these are ways that we build the world. And this, to me, is kind of the heart of ableism. It's building the world around and for that mostly imagined average prototype, that normal prototype, and kind of leaving everybody else out to dry. Scrambling to figure out how to fit into that plane or that city or that classroom that was not built with that in mind. And of course, again, it's important to underscore the greater the deviation from that imagined average, the greater the discrimination. Okay, so with all of that in mind, this new perspective, this new word, ableism, let's go back to that story of me, freshman in high school, sitting in the counselor's office, but add ableism to the backdrop. Like, what does that show us? How could that help us understand other folks who are trying to navigate an education system with a disability? So the first thing that I can see now is that I saw myself as the problem in that room, right? Like ableism says, this classroom, this lesson, this activity, this expectation, this assignment is right. And it suggests that most people, most teachers, most students fit really naturally, easily. It's a comfy fit for most of those people. And if you are struggling to fit in or keep up or manage in that space, then you are the problem in that situation. So as I was sitting alone on the edges of playgrounds or crying in my counselor's office, I knew something wasn't right. Like there was a problem, right? But I assumed that it was me. Something wasn't working, and surely it wasn't playground design or a school system, right? Like either I was made to be an outsider or I wasn't trying hard enough, but either way, like I was the thing that was wrong. So that is one thing that I can see, I can pinpoint now in retrospect. Another thing I can see now is that needing help made me feel ashamed. In fact, that feeling of shame kind of overwhelmed my ability to even articulate to that counselor what I was feeling, what I needed. I couldn't articulate that. Within the framework of ableism, like needing help is kind of already an automatic failure of sorts, right? I imagine this might be one of the reasons why less than half of students who show up to a college campus with a disability will disclose that disability on the front end, right? I remember when I taught college freshmen, I would have so many students coming to me around November or December to talk about needing an accommodation, and we would have so many conversations about how they had wanted so much to be able to show up to college and not need an accommodation, as if that meant that that option was a weakness or that using that tool was made them less than. But what a destructive myth is that, right? Like the myth that needing assistance or a tool or leaning on another person is a sign of weakness is so destructive, because who among us doesn't need assistance or a tool or another person to support us in one way or another? Like, in fact, knowing when to ask for help, knowing how to articulate what you need is actually a skill that takes guidance, that takes practice, and it deserves nourishment, right? It deserves to be nurtured in all of us. But as a kid, for me, that was not a skill set that was emphasized. In fact, I was wildly celebrated for every possible way that I overcame my disability. So if I would do anything without my wheelchair, if I was like didn't let my wheelchair slow me down. That was something to celebrate, but I didn't have this space or guidance to think about, what kind of limitation I might have or how to advocate for what support would make that easier. That's something I'm still working to figure out, right? Like so much later, that is a skill set. And the third thing I can see in retrospect is that I think in that moment, the counselor, but also a lot of people around me assumed that they knew what my barriers were because they assumed that they were the very visible ones. And because of that, there was a lot of invisible, barriers that were missed or that we didn't get a chance to explore. And it's not difficult for me to imagine how that happens. Like wheelchairs are very visible and accommodations for them can be really concrete. And I was grateful for all of those, right? Like every lift and every ramp was wonderful. But at the same time, I think there was a lot that my counselor and parents and other people around me kind of missed. I was dealing with a lot of chronic pain I didn't know how to manage. I had kind of the weight of this confusing experience of exclusion and disconnection that I didn't quite understand. And of course, that piece of the anxiety of trying to figure out how to move into the adult world. Like all of these things were weighing on me heavily, but that was kind of a missing piece. Okay, so this was me in early adulthood, and I would not suggest that this is like all students with disabilities feel this way. I don't think that's true at all, but this was what was true for me, and this is how I experienced things at that time. I think what we are all eager here to think about is like, what is the opposite of ableism, right? Like, how can we create communities in our classrooms and schools that push against ableism? And there are a lot of ways that we could approach this conversation. There are a lot of different directions to look. And I think there are a lot of resources that I hope that you are able to explore after this conversation. But for me, I tend to think about big picture shifts in perspectives, lasting shifts in perspectives, and habits of thinking that really help us build something for the long haul that make our spaces hospitable for everyone. So for the rest of the time that we have together, I want to focus on this practice of inclusion specifically for students with disabilities, but for all of our students, habits and thinking patterns that can really help us foster communities where everyone is thought of and wanted and welcomed. I know that a lot of us are working within education systems that are already in place, and there's a lot of momentum behind that, right? And each of you have kind of varying amounts of control of over the systems that are kind of governing your classrooms. Like anytime we're having a conversation about education, I think there is that like forever tension between the ideal dream of what this could and should look like, and then the messy reality of like the resources that we have and the parameters around us. And so I want to acknowledge that. And as I go through some of these ideas, some of them will be more or less applicable to you in your situation, or you might want to adapt them. But these are some mostly big picture, a few small practical ideas sprinkled in there for thinking about this. But that is the forever tension in these conversations. But the goal here for me today with you is not as much prescriptive as it's this desire to just open up our minds to imagine more possibilities for how we engage in our classrooms. Okay, so those are my caveats. Let's dive in. Okay, so some ideas to get us started. When we left my story, I was in a pretty rough space, right? Like having these really harmful beliefs about myself, growing up with this disability in an ableist world. And for me, the first step out of those harmful beliefs really was education, which is really suitable for this group that I'm talking about today, right? Like this is very on theme and within reach. Like as much as I wish that we could, we can't dismantle ableism overnight. Like this is a very deeply embedded system and structure in our world. But one thing that we can do right now that is very powerful is to learn and to lean into education, to give language to this experience of ableism, to be able to learn how to recognize it and point to it. to learn and to teach our students that while this is something that people experience, it's not right and it can change, right? I was 27 when I first learned the word ableism. I read it in a disability studies article, and then from there I started learning about the history of disability, how we kind of categorize it, define it, and separate it. I started learning about the history of eugenics and institutionalization and the long, hard, ongoing fight for disability rights. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that learning those little bits of history and language completely transformed the way that I saw myself. I saw the world around me. It transformed the way I saw my past. It informed the way that I saw my future. I had never learned any disability history in all of my school, right? I was in education for almost 25 years before I learned any of that. I had this vague sense that the Americans with Disabilities Act was important, but I didn't know any of the history. I had never heard of the Section 504 sit-in. Are we aware of the Section 504 sit-in in 1977 in here? Some of us? Okay, awesome. For those of you that aren't, you have to watch Crip Camp like as soon as you leave this room. It's a documentary on Netflix that tells a lot of that story, but essentially the Section 504 sit-in, a couple of disability activists led this group of about 150 disabled activists and people supporting them into the federal building, and they refused to leave that building until Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was signed, which was essentially the very first beginning little bits of legislation that would lead towards people with disabilities having civil rights. And they didn't leave that building for almost a month. And the federal government was like desperate for them to get out of there. They like cut the phone line, they cut off the hot water in the building. The protesters inside, when they realized that they were cut off from the public because the phone lines were cut, they like started signing through the windows to people outside to get messages to the press. Like, it's an incredible story. I wish we had an extra hour. I'm telling you the whole thing. Crip Camp. But I didn't know any of this history, right? I had no idea that people with disabilities were a part of this scrappy history. And that was a turning point for me because I realized that my exclusion wasn't actually right, or it wasn't a natural consequence of my inherent inferiority. And I also learned that I was a part of a group of incredible fighters and I was a part of an incredible story. So I think a big thing that we can do towards moving towards inclusion is education, which is perfect because that's what we do, right? Both as learners for ourselves, but also teaching our students these stories. I want to invite all of us into these stories, not as like extra homework, but as this invitation to learn about important part of human history. Regardless of current disability status, these stories are fundamental to understanding our larger part in the story that we're all playing out together. So I think today can be part of that education, right? But my story is like one of many. And so I have to point to a couple of other books that I highly, highly recommend, and I'll just cover these really briefly. And I think we actually have some of these in our prize section, which is perfect. Alice Wong, Disability, Visibility. Alice Wong is the editor of this collection of first-person narratives of disability, and there are so many different stories in this collection, so many different experiences of disability, intersections of identities around those disabilities. It's incredibly gorgeous and moving and important book. The Pretty One by Kia Brown is a collection of essays. I found Kia's book really eye-opening because Kia is writing about her experience of being a disabled woman with a physical disability, which is very similar to me. But she writes from a perspective of a Black woman, which is an experience that I don't understand. And the way that she writes about that was very illuminating to me to understand this this intersection that's different than mine. Demystifying Disability by Emily Ladau is a really useful resource for an ally. It's just like packed full of practical information, ideas and lists and language and terminology that can just be like that handy guidebook. And then of course, Judy Human's memoir, Being Human, and then the YA version of that is Rolling Warrior. Tells all of that history, that exciting, beautiful story of disability, the history of disability rights in the US. I threw my book on there too because if you're interested in this conversation, then you might be interested in that book. And there's a lot of overlap, right? If you haven't read it. Okay, all right. So these books are the ones that I recommend because they changed me in some way, but also because they're all first-person accounts of disability. When wanting to understand a marginalized experience, it's so important that we go directly to the voices of people who know that experience, and that is the case for all of these books. All right, so education was a first path towards inclusion. Education changed things for me. It gave me this sense of groundedness and empowerment that took me all the way through my PhD and right up to my first job at a grad school teaching high school. I had this new lens, this new perspective for understanding my experience in the world, and I was taking that to my first job, and I felt a little bit like I was like running through this wide open field of freedom and understanding, and then I like smacked straight into this brick wall. It was so jarring trying to adjust to this job of teaching high school. Gosh, I had like so much respect in the world for every high school teacher, all the teachers, but wow. Honestly, like if I try to think about the feeling that I had that first year teaching high school, it reminded me a lot of how I felt being that 14-year-old in that college counselor's office. And that takes me to this second path of inclusion. I've learned a lot as I've gotten older. I think that we create more inclusive environments when we bring human needs to the forefront instead of making some needs special or exceptional. Now, I'm very aware of the fact that the term special needs is deeply baked into a lot of our education systems, and that's not something that we can just like pull out overnight. But I do want to unpack this idea with you because I think it's important. You will hear a lot of adults with disabilities critique the term special needs for a number of reasons, but one of which is that there's this implication with that term that only some of us have needs, or that it creates an arbitrary hierarchy between the needs that we might have. Because as we all know, right, like we've already talked about, all humans have needs. They have different needs that require different supports, and some of us have greater barriers to accessing the supports that we need in order to have those needs met. That's a lot of repetition of the word need. But we all benefit, right? We all benefit when we can destigmatize the very human experience of having a need that requires support. So when I was teaching high school, the administration of that school was totally willing to make accommodations for me to participate, which was great. So they like the lunchroom wasn't accessible, and for a while they were having my lunches delivered to my office, and that was really helpful. At the same time, the culture itself at that school really made it difficult or embarrassing to ask for an accommodation. It was a really rigorous, high-achieving school where the faculty, there was like a sense of pride of never taking a sick day. The administration would mostly praise teachers for like staying late or showing up on weekends. There were teachers who would like roll their eyes when students needed accommodation plans. Like there was a culture in that school that really made it difficult to ask for anything extra. And I want to be clear, I'm very glad that they hired me and they weren't going to fire me for needing an accommodation. We talked about that hard fight for disability rights. And that was hard earned, and that's not something I want to fritter away or minimize. But the environment itself really discouraged having a need at all. And that didn't just hurt me. Like I saw the impact on my students. I saw the turnover of faculty was really high at that school. An environment that discourages having any kind of need is kind of like a recipe for burnout. And I burned out so hard that first year. Okay, I'm still recovering from the burnout that first year. But I stayed for 2 more years after that. And the shift that made the biggest difference for me was connecting with teachers who allowed me to see that they had needs too, who needed to lean on me just like I needed to lean on them. Think about all the different ways that needs show up as a teacher, right? There were teachers whose kids kept getting sick and they were having to stay home with sick kids. There were teachers who were caring for aging parents. There were teachers who were like in the middle of trying to sell their house and all the stress of that. There were teachers who were working a second job. And in that framework, like my needs were no longer so exceptional. I was just another teacher trying to figure out how to balance all of the complexities of life, the inevitable complications and difficulties of life. And this prompted a shift from like a more unsustainable individual model, like every man for himself, sorry if you trip and fall, to an interdependent model. Where we were all able to offer and receive support depending on our unique assets and needs and timing. And I cannot tell you how good it felt to be able to cover someone's class or like share a lesson plan when someone was in a pinch. I think that creating educational systems and classrooms that focus on the range of human needs instead of framing some needs as special or exceptional really destigmatizes support, and it creates this sturdier ecosystem for the three-dimensional human beings, teachers and students operating within that system. I think we have a lot of power to set the tone to do that in our classrooms, to like draw out the unique needs and assets of our students, to do that work of destigmatizing some needs, especially for our students with disabilities, and kind of building little microcosms of interdependence. I'm going to just give a few ideas to maybe get your mind churning of things you might do in your classroom space, but some things that I found useful. Talk about accessibility, access, accommodations, and support up front from the start of the year or the semester and consistently. I remember when I was a student and even teaching it in college, you have syllabus day and you go over all the important pieces of the class, and then on the last page of that syllabus in tiny print, because you're trying to squish everything into fewer pages, is the Disability Resource Center information, right? And kind of like the phone number that you need to go to. And we never talked about it. It was just there, right? But I think talk about it. Take up space to talk about that. Be clear that you want everyone in that room to be able to engage. You can talk about how you're striving to create a class, a course that's more inclusive to everyone there. You can tell them what you've been thinking about, maybe what changes you've made to your course. You can emphasize that they can come talk to you if they ever have that need throughout the year. I think a lot of students feel worried that if they go to a teacher that they will look like they're just trying to take the easy route, right? But like communicate early that you're a person they can come to talk to about that. I think the mere act of taking time for that conversation signals to your students what's important to you and how you value all of the learners in that space. If you're comfortable, and this is not going to be for everyone, but if you're comfortable, I think it can be helpful to be transparent about your own needs. And this can look like a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be major. It doesn't even have to be specifically related to disability. Like maybe you had to take a sick day, or maybe you relate to class because of something with childcare, or maybe you finished grading all the papers last night because you got a migraine, whatever that thing is. I think it can be really useful to demonstrate for your students not only that it's normal and natural to have a need come up, but also you have this chance to model like a mature and like a better way to do that, right? And to handle what happens when a need comes up. I think that can be really valuable. And then finally, this is one of my favorites. I think providing ongoing opportunities for students to reflect on their own learning and to share some of those takeaways with you can be a really helpful exercise for them and for you. A lot of students don't have a lot of practice thinking about their process. They assume that this is how it is for everyone. And they don't have a lot of input from someone to think through that process with them. So this can even just be like a few questions at the end of the paper or assignment. To prompt them thinking about how they went through that and what roadblocks or barriers they felt through it, or what strengths they recognized. My favorite way to do it, if it works for your classroom, is to have small group discussions. I think it's really cool for students to hear other students talk about their processes. They can see themselves differently, maybe notice a unique asset or barrier that they thought was everyone had, and realize that maybe that there's something unique to them as learners. So all of that I think can be useful for you as the teacher, for the student, and also the students in that discussion. All right, this is my third and final path towards inclusion. The last thing I want to talk about today is something that I learned the hard way, and I wish I would have learned it earlier as a teacher, but always striving to make more flexible models and more on-ramps or points of access for students in a class. And we could spend like a whole week on thinking about disability and course design. So I'm just going to try to like plant a couple of seeds that hopefully you can just keep talking with each other about in the months to come. Because we're already juggling so much as teachers, and often it's so easy for us to get in a rut or a routine and kind of lose sight of the very core essential goals, course goals or assignment goals that we have. And then by extension, I think we can often fail to imagine all of the different routes that students might take to meet those course goals or to show us or demonstrate that they've learned those course goals. As an English teacher, most classes, it's really common for a class to be built on like reading books, writing papers, maybe there are some classroom discussions and some quizzes thrown in there, but those are some pretty essential building blocks to the English class, right? I mean, those were the English classes I took growing up. So that is often the tools or the building blocks that I default relied on as an English teacher. And of course, there were always the students that struggled with that, but the philosophy was like, well, it makes sense. Not every student is going to thrive in my class. So that made sense. But I remember there was this freshman in my high school class, like freshman in high school class, who struggled so much to express himself in writing. And it was not for a lack of effort. Like he and I worked so hard to try to help him figure out how to choose the words and put them on the page in a way that made sense and said what he was trying to say. But it was a struggle. And I decided in this class that I was going to pivot, and I decided that I was going to, instead of having students write essays, I was going to have them do respond orally. So I would throw out an essay question, and I was going to have the students craft a response verbally. In real time. And a lot of my students hated this because it was new, right? Like they weren't in English class, we're supposed to write papers. What are you having us do? But one of my core goals for my students was that I wanted them to express original conclusions using textual evidence clearly and eloquently, right? Which doesn't have to be done in writing. So often in default English class, we have to do it in writing, but you can accomplish that course goal in other ways. And so I opened it up a little bit. We're going to just talk through it. I give everyone something like 3 to 5 minutes. It was really small to answer one open-ended question. And the students, most of them complained, but this one student floored me because I threw out this question to him and he took a beat and then he gave back the most eloquent, insightful, like fully formed thought. And not only had we found a way for him to demonstrate that he was learning in my class, but he had this new key that he could bring with him to all the other assignments that he had in my class and other classes. Like he learned something about his brain. I learned something about how students can be learning without being able to show you in the way that he handed them. I think when we open up the ways that we allow students to demonstrate their learning to us, we invite more learners to that table. And we allow students to broaden and fortify their skills, right? It's so easy to get stuck in this routine of like, this is the only way I can teach this information. This is the only way students can show me that they've learned it. But there's so many ways we can open that up. So often we think of disability as an afterthought, like we come up with an accommodation once someone has identified for us that they need it. And of course that's better than nothing, but it's not ideal. It can be really difficult for teachers and students to operate that way. And I realize that like we can't all go back to the beginning of our course designs and just like wipe it all away and start from scratch. I realize that that's not practical, but moving forward, we can practice refining our goals, honing in on what our goals are, and opening up our designs. We can do inventory, we can revise as we go, we can aim for greater flexibility, we can look for those on-ramps and other ways that we can open up, create points of access for our students. the question is, what are those fundamental goals that you have for students? And how are you currently asking students to show you that they've met those goals? And are there other ways that they can do that? Are there other science, other approaches, other ways that they can achieve those same goals? And that doesn't have to just apply to assessment. That's the example I gave, but this could also be looking at your class policies. It could be looking at the way that you're delivering content. Can you open up the way you're delivering content? Opportunities that you have, the students have to engage that content. So there's a lot of ways to do that. And there's not one rule. That's the thing, right? All of your classes have different goals. You're working with different students, but we can take stock. And we can think about opening up ways for more students to engage. All right, I'm about to wrap things up here. I want to take us back to the 1940s and those airplanes, those rigid designs that hadn't been redesigned yet, that were just for the average pilot. One of the things that is really interesting to me about that story is that most of the pilots fit those plane designs well enough, right? Like actually, in the scope of things, the proportion of planes that were crashing was pretty small. It doesn't take very many planes crashing for that problem to be urgent, right? But through creating these more flexible designs, they did make planes that worked better for all of their pilots. And I wonder what would happen if we thought about teaching that way. Like, what if we saw the students who were struggling to fit into our schools or our classrooms as urgent alerts that something within that whole system needed to be repaired or redesigned? What if we looked at those students not as problems that we need to work around, but as that host for clues to figure out how to create how to design classes and schools that work better for the whole group? It reminds me a little bit of Alice Wong, disability activist Alice Wong, has described folks with disabilities as oracles, which is a really interesting idea to me. She says that the ones on the edges of any given system are the ones that identify the parts of that system that aren't working. They're the first ones to know. They're the first ones to identify that something is not quite working here. When we listen to teachers and students who are on the edges, I think that when we make sure that those teachers and students don't fall through the cracks, we create systems that hold all of us better. The older that I get, the more I see disability in all of the different forms that it takes, that vibrant range, as an invitation to imagine more. I see disability as a source that prompts adaptation. I think it breaks us out of our old routines. I think it helps us build with sturdier designs. And as we move into the future, my vision or my hope that I imagine for the world is a world where we let go of our grip on the notion of normal as a valuable benchmark. A world where we're talking about access is absolutely fundamental for thinking about anything in community, right? That would be a fundamental part of the conversation. I think when I think about disability and inclusion in our classrooms, I think it requires looking at disability not as this fringe experience, not as the student that you should include because it's the right thing to do, but as an experience and perspective that we desperately need in the world with the same urgency that the Air Force felt when they realized that their planes were crashing and they did not know how to stop it. Instead of keeping disability like pushed to the edges, included in like a series of awkward workarounds and afterthought amendments, I want us to pull it to the center of the room, of the conversation, of our communities, at the center of our educations. That's my hope. That's my dream. So thank you for being here for this discussion. But I'm like so eager to get to our Q&A. So Jen's got the microphone. If whatever is on your mind, it doesn't even have to be a question, but like whatever it is that you would like us to talk about as a group, I'm really eager to dive into that with you.
Thank you for your book, by the way.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
And I had never heard of Capitol Crawl. And watching the video, and I'm a big Olympics fan, it was totally San Frodo. Making their way up that corridor.
Yes, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
But I worry about my classroom and in education broadly about rigor. It's really, rigor is not an average thing. For me, like I'm not great at math. My level of rigor to be pushed is very different from someone that has that mechanical line. And we have in recent decades started developing individual education plans for students. I think it's generally for students with accommodations. But that's becoming more common as more and more students. Is the long-term vision maybe everybody needs an individual education plan, or is a long-term vision that we need to create an environment where nobody needs an individual education?
That's a great question. Oh, what an interesting way to think about that. And just out of curiosity, what age do you teach?
I'm the college level.
You're the college level, okay. And just to go back to your question, to make sure I have your thoughts in place. You're worried that we're losing rigor? Yeah.
Well, so the rigor question is, the rigor issue is not related to that individual education.
Okay.
I am worried that we're losing rigor, and a lot of the things you talked about here, like first day of my class, we actually go to the Disability Services Center. We talk about, the fact that disabilities can be a whole range. You can break your arm halfway through the semester. That's a disability you have to deal with. Matter of fact, I guess I'm floating a little bit here. So the rigor thing is a separate issue.
Okay.
But my question really has to do with, as we're trying to imagine what the future of education, the future of our classrooms is going to look like, is it possible to scale up to the point where every person has an individual education plan? Or do we need to create an environment where anybody can flourish and it doesn't really matter what your accommodations are?
Yeah, I love that question, and I've never had anybody present it that way. But in my mind, from my experience, and I would picture a way of holding on to both a little bit. I think part of it is a lot of our classrooms now are unnecessarily rigid in the way that we structure things. And so opening that up, I think, is a huge part of just creating environments where more students are actually learning and growing. So I think that's fundamental. But I don't know, and I'm curious to know what others think. I don't know that there is such a thing as like a universally accessible classroom. I don't know that I see that as the ultimate goal. Because people's needs change, we don't always know what the needs are in that unique setup to begin with, right? So you can create as much flexibility as you can, but you can't anticipate everything. And so I think that I would imagine some combination of holding on to both of those things. Ideally, if we're going that direction, if we're thinking of the dream, I think an individual accommodation plan sounds awesome because I think every learner is so unique and distinct. My son is 3, and I'm already so anxious about are his teachers going to know all of the unique things that he's bringing to this experience and his strengths, and every learner is so unique. And so if there were the resources for teachers to be able to do that individually with students, I think that would be incredible. But I think trying to hold on to both the ideals and dreams and the practicalities, I imagine those working in sync or together. I think both are important. But yeah, I'm not curious what other people think about that. That is what I think about that. And I love the question, so thank you for that.
I could say something else.
We can always talk about rigor.
Well, I think more about assessment.
Questions? Topics of discussion?
Right, it doesn't have to be a
About
question.
assessment things, we have administrators
Ooh,
I
right.
would encourage administrators to push back and disagree. So if we are able to create this, obviously, education, I think it works best in groups. It works best when we have each other bounce off each other. But that individualized approach, I think all of us as instructors try to do that before trying to form those individual relationships. But we have also, I imagine, the K through 12 level, certainly in higher education, assessment and collecting data that is incredibly subjective, but we treat it like it's objective. Graduation rates.
Yeah.
We could just lower standards and everything and never be able to graduate. That's, or we could go crazy with rigor and nobody. These are subjective things, which again, maybe the administration was the perspective on that.
Yeah.
But is it possible that our focus on normalized assessment, because that's really what we're talking about, when we aggregate all these numbers, that is getting in the way of us moving towards this future of inclusion of everybody? Would we do better to acknowledge the subjectivity of experience and just trust teachers to do what's right by their students? Or we were talking about, without these measurements, we wouldn't know that that people with disabilities that drop out or aren't able to graduate. Are the numbers useful, or are they getting in our way?
Yeah, I have some pretty strong opinions about it from a teacher perspective. I've never had to be in the administration role or like that. As a teacher, I think it seems I think it seems pretty clear that a lot of the emphasis on testing is arbitrary, or it doesn't necessarily reflect anything meaningful, or there's much that we miss in that, right? And so I think the problem is maybe more that overemphasis, and I think especially in K-12 is what I'm thinking of. I think the overemphasis on looking at that as if the numbers are going up, then that is obvious success, and if they're going down, that like the black and white nature of that, and also that the striving is always like we're in this chase for higher scores all the time. The only thing that's better is more and more and more, right? That's an impossible game. And so there's a lot of ways in which that setup does not seem useful for learning. And that's, I'm like thinking about teachers who are having to keep a pace to teach to a test. All of that seems really counter to learning, in my opinion. But I do think that there, I mean, again, just to go back to what I talked about earlier with looking at data and statistics, is that there can be something useful. You can track some big picture, sort of like big trends or large patterns, but in terms of equating a test score with learning, it doesn't seem connected to learning at all to me. I mean, like there's and even with, I mean, like I don't know, this is maybe like an annoying thing to say in the room of teachers, but so much of what we do is grading. But even grading can be frustrating in that way, right? That like you have a student who whose growth is exponential throughout the course of the semester, but they struggled a lot at the beginning, and so they have a B. Versus the student that didn't grow very much, but it was always moving along easily, and so they have an A, and so that just feels arbitrary in a lot of ways, right? Like,
I just give that B student A.
Yeah. Oh, there's lots of ways to do that, right?
We have a little bit of brain.
Right. And then, like, there are ways to rearrange that and try to like put the piece together in a different way, but having to have an A mean something and a B mean something, when like learning is so complicated and multifaceted and ongoing. And so, yeah, there are a lot of things about the structure, the nature of the structure of it that are frustrating, and trying to, that's the tension, right? And trying to figure out how to work within a system in a way that fosters learning and doesn't let the more rigid parts of that system take over and consume the learning. So I have some pretty strong things about testing, and I think that like my idealism about learning is unrealistic in a lot of ways. In that, like, if you're trying to, I think part of it is that we are with schools, we're trying to create a system that is so large and that we can replicate, and that kind of we can create the machine of that, and that is efficient, but maybe less effective. And so there's so many things that we're having to balance, the practicality and the reality and the idealism. But I would love it if we could move away from our obsession with task force. I think that would be a really good move.
I don't know if there's any administrators that want to push back, whether they have questions on Zoom.
Oh, yes, that's a good point. I'm gonna check that. Yes, do people, if you have any questions, type them into the chat, if there's a chat.
I have a question. You mentioned about rigidity.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious what people think and what you think. Because I feel like so often as a teacher, even as a parent, I find myself thinking about like what my room should look like when someone comes in. Like I have a student who I just let lay on the counter. And they're an awesome student and their grade works how their grade works and they answer questions when called on and they lay on the counter. And that's fine, like that's great, I love it. But there's some part of me from whatever my background or my training that I kind of like, I hope nobody walks in on your classroom today and sees the student laying on the counter. But that's me and that's my own rigidity and my own, I don't know what expectations about what a classroom should look like. And so I'm wondering if collectively people have thoughts about like, let's get rid of what we think a classroom should look like with everybody in their chair, raising their hands and not doodling. Or, I don't know. Anyway, I'm just curious about that question.
Yeah. Oh, I love that picture that you gave of your class. That sounds like a wonderful class. I want to be in that class. Yeah. No, and even that's interesting that you say that, like even as a parent, like it's interesting how you can know your ideals and know your values, and then when people are watching how vulnerable that can be. Gosh, I don't even know. Was there a question in there, or we're just talking about rigidity? No, there doesn't have to be. Yeah.
We have administrators.
Yeah, how can we get rid of this like self-imposed ideas of what this should look like? Yeah, and I think so much of that, I think, is easier when you are on the same page with your colleagues, right? Like when we are doing this together, not only just from like I don't have to be self-conscious about what it looks like vantage point, but also just from like a collaborative standpoint. It's like, what do you do in this situation, or what? How would you respond to the situation? Like having shared values in that sense goes on a really long way. And I know that that isn't something we always have control over, but collaborating with the teachers that you work with to be able to kind of have instill those shared values. And then you can see what their classrooms look like, and that maybe can give you ideas too. I think the doodling one is such a good example. Like for so long, that has seemed like a signal that someone's not listening, right, or that they are tuning out. And we know so much more about how, like, for a lot of people, that means that they are focused and that they're able to stay grounded in that. So maybe part of it also is our learning as educators about like all the different ways that our brains work and what learning can look like, and seeing that together. But also, you mentioned, like, I'm curious about what other people have things to say about rigidity. It looks like somebody definitely does. Rigidity, or I think rigor maybe is another topic that we can throw out there.
It's part of less of a comment.
Yeah.
So, coming from the student who needed to lay on the counter and understand and or cookie system, to now being an educator and pushing and advocating for like alternative seating and harassment, and now being a parent and seeing my daughter go through like more get ready to like she's just as interested as I am, so I'm anticipating those conversations of, well, she gets in her seat, she talks a lot, she's not on topic. Well, she's completing her work. Guess what? So did I, and look where we are. You know, so it's like you think that might be what parents think, but it's like some parents may have a completely different lens.
Yeah.
That was that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I don't know, that's I just try to keep it like that. Not
Yeah, well, and I love that you understand that experience on so many dimensions. Like you know that from so many perspectives. And I think, you know, that kind of reminds me of myself as a mom and the things that I like, that piece of like knowing your values and what happens when people are watching. And it does seem like personally, so much of that has to do with feeling very, very grounded in what you know to be true. Like being very connected to what you know about your students, what you know about learning, what you know as a teacher, and trusting that. That can be really hard and like an ongoing thing. But I think that that piece of it feels like that is something that you have a little bit more control over than like who you're working with, or and knowing what parents are thinking, but knowing for yourself what you're doing and why it's important. And also I love the point that like maybe the parents are like, this is exactly what we were hoping. This is exactly that you see our kid, and you see our child, and that you're treating them as a whole human kid. Yeah. There's another hand.
We are beholden to money in order to have schools. The people who are making the rules about the money, their experience in school oftentimes is very different from what is going on today.
Yeah.
Like you talked about, where students with disabilities were not a part of their classroom, and it was, some strategies, I don't know that. It's very poor choices regarding instruction for those students who were struggling, weren't sitting, and I think we need to educate and say, look, what you experienced with, and I mean, even just mom was at home a lot of times, and just so much, it's like, what you went to school and how you experienced is not, and we need to get those people into the schools. They need to understand what we're facing. We need to educate parents, because then when we say, look, we need, optional different types of seating, because they're going to be behind it instead of just, they just want to have funky seating or whatever.
Yeah.
We need to do that,
Yeah.
and that's a big struggle. Is I think, especially higher ups, a lot of them came from maybe even a financial situation in which everybody at their school was exactly the same. You don't see that.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we have to do ourselves a favor.
Yeah, and I imagine that so much of that is figuring out for yourself and knowing how to articulate that message, like knowing that you're already doing it now, this is why this is important. This is what we know about students and learning. This is how the world looks different now, like having a really focused message to be able to tell that story and why it's important. And you're the experts and you're the ones on the ground who know, right? So yes, I'm into that. I think that should be done too. Yeah.
So I would just share, when I think of the word inclusion, it's really about how we bring people to the table so that they are sitting next to us. And I will get on my soapbox because I got the money. And it's really about the role of the community colleges and higher education, and the importance of who our learners are, and that they are at different points, and the opportunity to provide experiences that provide the optimum balance of challenge and support. So it goes back to the discussion about rigor. You must have rigor, because we all rise to the challenge. Human beings rise to the challenge. And so you've got to have, for personal growth and development, whether you be a learner in any setting, it is about the optimum balance of challenge and support. And so each of us comes to the table as educators. And we want our learners to come to the table with us. And we're helping our elected officials, because I refuse, Wendy, to call them higher ups. Elected officials who make decisions about what we and how we get our money, they are citizens. They are citizens of our state that we have voted for. And so it's so important that we bring them to our tables, not educate them. They've got to come to our tables and be with us and understand what we're doing in our classrooms every single day. And it is so important. And I can go off on the data for hours, because, for example, you should never measure a community college at graduation rates. It's about completion. because we have 14,500 learners, and all of them are here for a different reason. And so how do they complete their goal, which isn't often a degree? It's getting their GED. It is English language learning. It is their citizenship certification. It is taking 3 classes so that they can be a behavioral health specialist. There are things that we do that it's not about an associate's degree. It's about helping them to be ready for the whatever's next. And so I don't measure our success on our graduation rates. It's a number that everybody wants to know, and it tells a story. However, that is not our success. Our success is helping empower people to meet their goals, whatever that might be. And don't have systems to measure that. You know it every single day with your learners, every single day. And how do we celebrate that and award and reward that and make sure that we're celebrating that at every turn? So awesome.
Yeah.
And I hate to say, we have gone over time.
Oh.
I want to acknowledge that and respect your time. A couple of things that I want to say before we leave here is how much I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate the support that we have received locally. We have sponsors from the local area, including our exclusive healthcare sponsor, Healthy Blue, and also sponsorship from the Norfolk Area Community Foundation Fund and the Norfolk Area Visitors Bureau. And then we have so many amazing partners throughout our service area. Lots of libraries, of course. The Norfolk Public Library has been instrumental in the Big Read, the Elkhorn Valley Museum, which you can visit for free as part of the Big Read through May 12th. So if you haven't been there, they have an exhibit specifically curated for these events, and it's really wonderful. Also, the Norfolk Arts Center, vendors downtown, the district event center. So many partners. I really cannot list them all, but I am very appreciative. And I want you to know that if you would like to see Rebekah again, we're having an informal reception at 5 o'clock today in the lower level of Union 73. And then we will be moving to the upper level at 6 o'clock for her reading. She will take questions then as well. And if you have your copy of the book, City Pretty, you can bring it along, and I think she will sign it for you. Yeah, I put her on the spot.